You know, I was young once. A kid even. But I didn't know how to live and let die. And when I got the idea to review Final Fantasy I couldn't resist myself. The only problem was I didn't know which version to review, so I picked 3 of them. It has been 50 years since that fateful day. I've wasted my life. My entire life! And for what? A couple hundred views on YouTube! Thankfully, I found a way to make things right. I have found a way to go back in time to stop myself from reviewing this game. The only problem is that I've become molecularly unstable in my advanced age from the time travel process. I need to make sure that I find myself before I get lost to the annals of time. Ugh. Why is it so dusty down here? You know, maybe it's something in the air, but I've been thinking about Final Fantasy I a lot lately, and namely whether or not the game holds up after all these years out on the market. And in trying to answer that question, I've stumbled upon a response that's admittedly a bit of a cop-out. You see, it actually really depends on which version of Final Fantasy I you're talking about. Are you talking about the NES original or the MSX2 port? How about the WonderSwan Color remake, which became a PlayStation 1 port, a Game Boy Advance port, and a PSP version of the game? Or the iOS and Android versions that were spawned from that PSP version, the 3DS version, or last year's Pixel Remaster, which is another remake of the game entirely? Because, this stuff actually matters. These versions have differences. Final Fantasy is one of the seminal JRPGs that, along with Square's future partner via merger Enix's Dragon Quest, established many of the tropes that would go on to define the genre for decades to come. Originally released in 1987 by Squaresoft on the Famicom, the game is a top-down RPG where you create a party and go on an epic quest through the open world of in order to save the planet from evil. Directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the game is notable for being one of the titles to successfully bring the gameplay of popular Western PC RPGs like Ultima to Nintendo's Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. In an oft-repeated story, it's been theorized that the game got its name after Square had run into some financial issues that threatened bankruptcy if the game was to fail, along with Sakaguchi vowing to go back to school if it didn't prove to be successful. While this would later get refuted to some degree by the man himself, as he originally wanted to call the game Fighting Fantasy, there's no denying that a romanticized tale like that is pretty awesome, and that any semblance of truth to the story of Final Fantasy being a bit of a Hail Mary move for its creator and publisher is more than enough to imbue it with an almost sacred aura. Because we all love an underdog story, and Final Fantasy representing a company at death's door trying to find mainstream success with a game in a relatively niche genre definitely has the makings of a certain John G. Avildsen picture. You know, the Karate Kid. At any rate, Final Fantasy would quickly garner a fair bit of critical praise when it was released, with gaming outlets from over the years like GamesRadar, IGN, and Famitsu all agreeing that it ranks amongst the best games on the NES. It's since been remade into oblivion, gotten everything from the recent prequel spin-off Stranger of Paradise to a manga adaptation, a novelization, and spawned a massive franchise that, along with Star Wars, is probably responsible for teaching an entire generation or two of kids how to read Roman numerals. P.S. Final Fantasy XIV is also just heaps of fun. Final Fantasy is one of those franchises that's been in my life for just about as long as I can remember. Even though I wasn't that much of a fantasy person growing up, I distinctly remember enjoying about half a dozen or so Final Fantasy games that I had accumulated over the years. And regardless of the fact that I never really got that far into those games as a kid, they've always been a huge source of nostalgia for me and have always kind of lit my imagination ablaze thanks to their iconic imagery, music, and graphics. My history with Final Fantasy I actually goes back to sometime in the early 2000s, when my dad got me a used copy of Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance, which contains remakes of Final Fantasy I and II on a single cartridge. Despite being historically terrible at JRPGs and struggling to get particularly far in either games due to getting lost, I recall loving nearly everything about what I experienced with both games. And seeing as I've been methodically working my way through various Final Fantasy titles since about 2020 or so, I figured now was as good a time as any to give Final Fantasy I another shot. But does it hold up? Because while the game is undeniably good, seminal, and stands alongside the original Dragon Quest as the blueprint to which all other JRPGs at least owe some of their design, that's not to say that it's necessarily aged well or is even worth revisiting these days. I mean, it's practically had more comebacks than Rocky Balboa has in the form of updated ports or remakes, so you just know that Final Fantasy I hasn't aged well on some level. And that's okay, by the way. Like, if anything, it's actually kind of awesome that Square Enix was able to recognize that their golden goose was still good for a couple of eggs. It's just that we're now left with a bigger question than the usual does it hold up. For once, we're presented with the question of which version of the game holds up best for you, because each of these versions offer tweaked experiences that are just as valid as the other ones you can choose from, and while many of them are somewhat arbitrary in those changes, a few of them are also pretty different due to them too. So today, I'm gonna take a look at 3 different versions of Final Fantasy I from over the years, because I genuinely believe that this game is still good, but that it's important for players getting into it for the first time to pick the right version for their particular interests. And just to get this out of the way, as well as mostly for the sake of my own sanity, I won't be covering every version of the game that's ever been released. There's simply too many of them out there, and after spending the past few weeks playing nothing but Final Fantasy I and the occasional round of Mario Golf, I can comfortably say that I'm effectively burnt out on the game and probably JRPGs for at least a couple of months. However, the 3 versions that I've decided to cover in this video do seem to offer the widest variety in playstyles and experiences, so I genuinely hope that you guys won't be too bothered by that. If you're looking for a list of the different versions of the game and the differences between them, I highly suggest watching Austin SV's video on Final Fantasy, as it's insanely comprehensive and goes into way more detail about the various changes between versions than I will here too. Anyway, the 3 versions I'll be covering today are the original US NES release of Final Fantasy, the PSP version that was released for the game's 20th anniversary and iterates on several years worth of versions that started with the WonderSwan Color remake from 2000, and the recent Pixel Remaster that's available on PC and mobile at the time of this video being made. I feel that these versions of the game all bring their own unique strengths and weaknesses to the table, and that they offer the greatest balance of different experiences for different kinds of players to make comparing them a relatively straightforward task. These 3 versions of Final Fantasy I are all interesting in the sense that they're all ostensibly the same game, but that the different creative decisions that went into each release of them have changed them somewhat into being different variants of the same product. And seeing as I love messy analogies, it kind of reminds me of Coca-Cola of all things. The NES version of Final Fantasy I is a lot like the original recipe for Coca-Cola, you know, the one that has cocaine in it, because it's the original experience of the game for better or for worse. Likewise, the PSP version of the game is a bit like the 80s product New Coke, just without the public backlash and less max headroom, because it updates and changes things from the original experience. And last, there's the Pixel Remaster, which is the equivalent of the current incarnation of Coca-Cola. In basically taste testing this game 3 times back to back, it really accentuated to me the fact that these versions are different from each other and that the version a newcomer may go with will definitely influence whether or not they'll enjoy this game. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a game that's on your backlog? How'd it make it there? And why do you think you haven't gotten around to it yet? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And if you're new here and are enjoying what you see so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel and stuff so that you can check out all the other videos I'll be putting out in the future. On top of that, you're more than welcome to subscribe or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon if you so please. And you can also check out my retro movie and TV podcast, Media Obscura, if that's your sort of thing. And with that out of the way, on with the video. One of the great things about Final Fantasy I's adventure is that it leaves almost all of its characterization for your party up to you, the player. Due to the game's roots in tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, or if you're Tom Hanks in the 1982 made-for-TV satanic panic romp Mazes and Monsters, you're free to decide what to name your party as well as what classes they'll be. You know, assuming that's your kind of thing to begin with and that you don't struggle to come up with character names all the time like I do.
Hello, I am a dwarf named Zippity-Doo.
Okay, I'm not the best at making up names.
Oh, hey, I'm Mar. Well, you weren't kidding.
This offers a ton of replay value for those interested in going through the game's campaign multiple times, as it allows them to customize their experience with the game based on how they'd like their quest to unfold. While future games in the series would later introduce preset character classes, establish canonical names, and give each of the player-controlled characters dialogue, arcs, and, actual characterization, the blank template approach that Final Fantasy I takes can still be found in MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV or more Western RPGs like the Elder Scrolls games, and is generally a lot of fun for how it encourages some actual role-playing on the part of the player. Honestly, Final Fantasy's approach to characterization does a fairly great job at describing a lot of the game's appeal for modern players. While no doubt groundbreaking back in the 80s, especially as something released for home consoles, the game's story and mechanics definitely lean towards being more embryonic ideas that the franchise would later refine with its sequels than being fully formed here in this game itself. And yeah, that's a bit of a no-brainer given the fact that this game came out 35 years ago, but it's really cool getting to look back at this game both in the context of when it came out and as a person trying to investigate how well it holds up in 2022. Even though the game's simple story, which opens up on a prelude about 4 warriors of light going on a quest to rescue a princess before getting to a main quest about restoring the power and light to each of their elemental crystals, often feels a bit scant on details, or for lack of a better term gravitas, there's actually a lot of charm to it. I won't pretend that the game even begins to touch on the storytelling that later entries like Final Fantasy VII or IX had, but seeing this game establish as many of the genre conventions as it does here is still really impressive. To use movies as an example, playing a game like Final Fantasy is a bit like watching some of the first feature films. Not in the sense that it's a racist revisionist history piece of propaganda like 1915's The Birth of a Nation or romanticizes crime like 1906's The Story of the Kelly Gang were, but rather in the sense that its story and general structure still feels relatively fresh in spite of decades, and in the case of those movies, a literal century of so-called progress. Yes, parts of the game's story and world building feel one note and somewhat cliche as a modern player, but these elements weren't entirely done to death yet back in 1987, and as such, only became cliches after games iterated on them in part due to the success of this game itself. It's sort of like this moment from the 7th season of Gilmore Girls when Lorelai and Emily are at the hospital talking about cliches.
The audacity of charging money for this.
Well, it's hospital food.
What's that supposed to mean?
I'm saying it's cliche.
What is?
Hospital food being bad.
Exactly.
What?
It's a cliche for a reason. Cliches are just true things that people are tired of being true. Like a penny saved is a penny earned. Well, it is invested wisely.
And yeah, I totally just quoted Gilmore Girls on this channel. Bet you weren't expecting that. If you haven't seen it though, I highly recommend it. It's a great show, actually. Plus, it's not like Final Fantasy's narrative is completely devoid of nuance or insight in its storytelling either. I could just be overthinking things here, but I find it particularly interesting that the game opens with a Save the Princess mission of all things before broadening its horizons to encapsulate a globe-trotting and vaguely metaphysical adventure. Given the fact that Final Fantasy originally came out on the NES, a console that's synonymous with Mario and Link's early adventures to rescue princesses of all things, it almost feels as though the game is subtly poking fun at the fact that its ambitions are grander than that. Going back to film, it reminds me of the sort of bait and switch pulled by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960's Psycho. One of the things that always stuck out to me about Hitchcock's black and white horror movie is the fact that its first act is a delicate ruse due to how it sets up the character Marion Crane as being our protagonist before, well, you know. And in the same way, Final Fantasy sets us up with a familiar story of saving a princess before allowing us to actually succeed without needing to stop at a few extra castles first. Enough about the story though. I think it's high time that we took a look at the actual meat and potatoes of Final Fantasy I. Its gameplay. Final Fantasy is a classic Square JRPG in every sense of the word. It's got turn-based battles, random encounters, and loves to give you a small array of transportation methods that nullify the utility of your previous ones. And much like how the basic structure of Final Fantasy's story has since been aped in subsequent entries, a lot of these characteristics have managed to endure in some form or another in their sequels, albeit further developed and somewhat more engaging in its execution. But I'd hardly say that this has left the first game feeling dull by comparison, because Final Fantasy's gameplay still packs a wallop where it counts. Despite my preference for the tension and sense of interactivity that the later game's active time battles would add to the series, the first game's combat is, for the most part, pretty charming in its relative simplicity. Additionally, while simple by today's standards, the game's combat still packs a pretty mean punch, due in large part to how open-ended it can be and how dependent it is on the party you've created for your adventure. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses of your party is a staple of any RPG, but Final Fantasy I feels especially open-ended for the series due to being one of the few games in it that actually allows you to create your party from scratch. You get to make fun considerations, like deciding whether or not to use a monk or black belt who can dish out heaps of damage at the cost of being objectively worse when you start giving him items and equipment, or adding a warrior to your ranks, because what's a high fantasy adventure without a dude bro tanking for the team? And you also get to decide whether or not to use a white or black mage on your team when you could just go with a red mage instead, because they can cast both types of spells and they get to wear a dumb looking cape at the same time.
I don't trust men in capes.
And you can't cast aspersions on someone just because they're wearing a cape. Superman wore a cape. And I'll be damned if I'm gonna stand here and let you say something bad about him.
You know, the guy's got a point. These are all valid questions that, for casual RPG players like myself, feel like they were given a bit more weight than I'm used to having in games in the first place. Final Fantasy I's fairly laissez-faire approach to storytelling extends to the gameplay in the sense that, aside from some dialogue that you might get from an NPC, you're never really told what you need to do next. Like, you might understand where you need to go on a literal level, but the game is fairly hands-off in the sense that it expects you to piece together the additional context of how you actually need to accomplish that thing and where the pieces of that context may be in the actual world. It's not perfect, and at least in my experiences with it, Final Fantasy can prove to be a bit too hands-off for my liking, but I do appreciate that the game invites the player to get lost in uncovering the intricacies of the world by simply throwing you into the deep end to figure it out. Building off this hands-offness is the game's customizability, which is another staple of JRPGs. Heck, the endless and uber-capitalist pursuit of more loot is arguably one of the defining characteristics of the genre that's since been chop-shopped from RPGs and thrown into just about any other game that can bear its weight. And why? Because it's fun. Knowing that at any moment you could stumble onto the next town in your adventure and get absolutely zonked out of your mind on a power trip due to some fancy new spell is the stuff that dreams are literally made of. And while the game's equipment is relatively clear-cut and straightforward in its strengths and weaknesses, unlike something like Final Fantasy XIV, which is a bit of a high cognitive load info dump in my opinion, there's still a nice bit of strategy and satisfaction to it. It's nothing too complex, but it's a nice layer of detail that makes the combat feel less brain-dead and also gives the player some sense of control over their party's strength. Which is a pretty good way to describe Final Fantasy I in a nutshell, I think. It's a relatively simple JRPG with many of the expected tropes and cliches of the genre that benefits from a few touches to give the player a sense of control over their adventure. And I think that the game's sense of control is arguably its strongest quality. It feels more like it's trying to evoke the experience of playing a tabletop RPG than it does evocative of trying to tell an epic story or feature tight and refined gameplay. The simplicity, which I feel the need to clarify is not a bad thing by nature, feels like it's there to encourage the player to do some of the heavy lifting in terms of its narrative and gameplay, to make us engage ourselves in the game through the use of imagination and roleplay. I don't get it. And if you can't get behind that and think that such tropes and cliches would make for a fairly boring or uninspired adventure, then this may just not be the kind of game you'd want to play in the first place. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy I is a great game, and it's not that hard to see why it proved to be the hit that it was back in the late 80s. The game is really successful in grabbing the player's attention and in evoking a sense of them going on a globe-trotting adventure, complete with secrets to uncover, townsfolk to chat with, and a cohesive, albeit simple plot that can be expounded upon either by the player's imagination, the lore provided in something like its accompanying Nintendo Power Guide, or even the mid-2000s novelization or late 80s manga adaptation. That said, even though the game is definitely good, it's far from perfect and definitely shows its age at the same time too. But that's not to say that one of the different releases of Final Fantasy I may not be what you're looking for. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the game has gotten a literal smorgasbord of re-releases over the years that have all kind of updated and changed things a bit here and there. And who's to say that one or two of those changes may not be just what you needed in order to get through this game and have a good time with it. So I think it's high time that we dove into 3 different versions of Final Fantasy I, starting with its original NES release. The NES version of Final Fantasy is the most dated of the bunch. Are you really that shocked by that statement? Despite the fact that the game was a literal trailblazer for the genre and helped popularize many of the qualities of the JRPG, a lot of the actual finessing of those qualities leaves a lot to be desired. For example, while I complimented the game's combat as being fun in and of itself, the actual random encounter rate and experience scaling of the game is just a bit too out of sorts for its own good. Random encounters are plentiful, the experience gained from those encounters feels unbalanced and generally low, and these two things are a recipe for a grindy, tedious gameplay loop that also happens to suffer further from being extremely slow. For example, casting a spell that hits multiple enemies at once is an exercise in patience all in itself. The combat's still fun, mind you, but it's definitely the roughest version of the combat in the versions I'm covering today by far, and offers few qualities that put it above the more refined takes found in its remakes. And that's without even accounting for its 2 most defining characteristics, the game's magic system and the fact that some of its spells are just flat out broken. Final Fantasy I's different from the many games that followed it in the sense that as opposed to having a specific amount of magic points, mana, or the good shit available to you to tap into to cast spells, each of the game's techniques are locked behind a level/tier that can be used a specific number of times before needing to get recharged at an inn or cottage. And while the system isn't that bad in theory and even has a decent comparison in Pokemon's PP system, which is relegated to specific attacks, it ends up feeling fairly frustrating for casual or less skilled players at the start of their adventure due to them having access to less healing spells in general, as well as not having yet had the chance to collect enough money to hoard potions. And like I mentioned just a second ago, some of the spells don't even work the way they're supposed to in the first place, like the spell Temper, which is supposed to increase your party members' strength during battles and doesn't work in the slightest in the NES version. And while the pendulum does swing both ways there, with moves like Heal 2 actually working as Heal 3 in battle and restoring extra health to your party, it's still frustrating to find bugs in fairly important spells during your adventure. What I'm getting at is that Final Fantasy I is a quirky little game. And while those quirks are interesting and certainly a part of why so many people like that game to this day, they're also frustrating because it's not that big of an ask to expect the game to work right to begin with. The generally unforgiving nature of the combat in the NES game kinda explains the entirety of my view on this version of it in general. The game has a bunch of growing pains that the genre had to go through in order to become what it is today that make it an obtuse experience for newcomers, and while that's certainly understandable from a historical point of view, it gets in the way of actually enjoying the game for me. For example, combat lacks the sort of automatic retargeting that has since become a staple for the genre. What this means is that you can essentially waste moves if you happen to kill an enemy before another character has had the chance to attack yet, and when coupled with the aforementioned magic system, this can quickly prove to be really frustrating. Alright, so here's an example for you. Imagine you and your best friend Mike are walking home from the local deli one day when you get jumped by 3 ruffians. Now, Mike is a third-degree black belt, and a pretty good one at that, so you know you'll be fine, but you do also have to hold your own until he decides to actually beat these guys up. And lo and behold, let's say you actually manage to take a guy out all on your own. That's awesome and totally an accomplishment you're gonna brag about for the rest of your life, but Mike's weird. Mike, being the lovable best friend that he is, decides to target the person you've already taken down, hitting him repeatedly while his friends gang up on you in the corner. Heck, even grinding to level up your party is affected by this due to the simple fact that you can't do it as mindlessly as you're able to in other JRPGs. Am I docking points from the game over this? Not quite, since I get that grinding is a huge part of the genre itself, but it is worth mentioning since it's especially egregious here because of that quirk in the combat. What results from this is the fact that the NES version of Final Fantasy is probably the hardest version of the game, which is actually great if you happen to be looking for a bit more of a challenge, I guess. The lack of automatic retargeting forces you to be strategic and to look at battles as more of a game of chess than a simple spamming of the attack button, and that's awesome if you're prepared for it. Likewise, the magic system is a fun constraint to have placed on you, as is the game not featuring series staple items like ethers or Phoenix Downs. It definitely doesn't mean that the game is held up, at least for me, but I can see why folks would be interested in seeking this version out. A huge part of what I found to be this version's charm is the fact that it's the original version of the game and that by proxy, it's the most authentic version of it. And if that matters to you and you're willing to put up with the game's numerous quirks and growing pains, then this might be worth your time. As is, it's a great game that definitely leaves a lot to the imagination and does a really great job of evoking a sense of adventure through being as impressionistic of a fantasy game as it can be on 8-bit hardware. From its simple but lovely battle screen to its delightful chiptune soundtrack, it feels like the blueprint for a much grander adventure because, well, it is. While I'm on the subject of the battle screen though, I do have to mention that it's worth playing this game with frame skipping enabled on an emulator though if you happen to suffer from epilepsy or tend to get visually overstimulated because yikes, this game sure loves its flashing screens. Ultimately, Final Fantasy on the NES is the original Final Fantasy experience, both for better or for worse. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is basically the original recipe for Coca-Cola, only, applied to Final Fantasy. So if you happen to be looking for some historically accurate and cocaine-infused soda pop, this is the version to go with. However, it's not your only option. There's also the next version we'll be covering, which is the PSP release of Final Fantasy. If you were to look this game up on its 23andMe page, you'd find that this version is based off of the WonderSwan Color remake from 2000, which updated stuff like the graphics and gameplay a bit and brought in some other things to bring it more in line with other Final Fantasy games from the era. Released to celebrate the game's 20th anniversary, the PSP version of Final Fantasy I has spent over a decade as being the de facto way to experience the 1987 original. This is mostly due to adopting all of the changes and updates from the versions that preceded it, presenting the game in 16:9 for those that care, and revamping the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation versions' already slick-looking sprites with higher quality and more detailed versions of them. Opening on the sprites though, I gotta admit that I wasn't a fan of them at first. It isn't that they're bad per se, but rather that something about them just kinda stood out to me as being a little too clean. Maybe I was just used to the more jagged appearance of these designs from the Game Boy Advance version since I grew up with it, but I couldn't help but initially feel like these sprites looked way too cheap for some reason. I don't think that's the case anymore though. In fact, I actually adore these sprites for looking the way they do now. There's a nice bit of nostalgia to them for me since I owned a PSP in middle school and really enjoyed my time with that console. In trying to explore my initial thoughts on the art style, I think it just initially came off as being an overly sanitized representation of something I was already deeply familiar with. For those of you that grew up watching Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Kai, these visuals kinda gave me the same cognitive zap that seeing randomly redrawn shots in Kai would give me. Like, they weren't bad, but they also just felt extraordinarily digital and quote-unquote different from the cel-shaded style of the original footage. Also new to this version of the game was the inclusion of environmental effects that are a nice little touch and adds to the immersiveness of the game and serves as a nice bit of visual flair. Oh yeah, but much like the NES version, this game also loves its flashing screens, so watch out for that if that'll be a problem for you. Anyway, this version of the game stands out from the other ones I'm covering today in the sense that it offers the most traditionally Final Fantasy experience of the bunch and also has the most content. However, in becoming a more traditionally Final Fantasy experience, it had to update the NES version's gameplay and in turn lost some of its identity. Which is exactly why I consider it the New Coke variant of Final Fantasy I. For the uninitiated, New Coke was a rebranding and recipe change for Coca-Cola back in the 80s that was designed as a means to cut into some of Pepsi's growing market share. Essentially, a bunch of suits at the soda company did a bunch of Coke one day, haha, and decided that people were sick of their iconic American beverage. Never mind the fact that Coca-Cola was an omnipresent force in the fizzy, teeth-rotting beverage industry, and never mind the fact that their drink was already popular enough to literally codify Santa Claus as being the jolly guy in a red suit that we all know and love. They wanted some of that sweet money that Pepsi had started to sap away from them. What resulted from that was updating their beloved drink into being New Coke. A business decision that received a ton of backlash, gave me an excuse to mention Max Headroom since he was the drink's mascot, and may as well be the carbonated equivalent to how people treat the perfectly fine for what it is new Super Mario Bros. Series.
They can't do it. That's un-American because we fought wars to have a choice, to have freedom.
Like, I'm all for voicing your dissatisfaction with a product because it's your right as a consumer to do so, but imagine using war and freedom to justify being up in arms about the taste of your soda pop. And to the person who's thinking of commenting that I wasn't born yet and that I wouldn't understand, you're absolutely right. I wasn't born yet and I wasn't around to storm the beaches of dealing with mediocre soda flavor, but like, it's soda. And even though this version of Final Fantasy I didn't really get the same grief that New Coke did, I still feel like it serves as a worthy comparison on an aesthetic level due to how it updates the NES version's formula in order to be quote-unquote new and modern. You see, part of why people didn't like New Coke was the fact that it didn't taste so much like Coca-Cola anymore, but rather that its flavor suddenly more closely resembled Pepsi's. In other words, even though New Coke probably tasted pretty good in and of itself, it sort of betrayed the appeal and some of the defining characteristics of the brand in the first place. And that betrayal is similarly the biggest critique that I can levy against this PSP game. Because ultimately, the 20th anniversary version of Final Fantasy I is a pretty awesome game that features a bunch of changes that definitely improve the experience, but also obfuscates what made the NES game special in the first place. It features a ton of quality of life improvements from over the years, such as a world map that cuts down on getting lost, some short and generally adorable cutscenes to make the world feel a bit more lived in and alive, and it also features automatic retargeting, which essentially mic-proofs the game for you. Not that you can really mic-proof something to begin with. And it doesn't stop there either. The game features a normal MP system, the CG cutscenes that open the PS1 version of the game, and it also features bonus dungeons and exclusive content in it. Plus, it also features a wonderfully updated soundtrack that adds heaps of detail and nuance to the original NES score, which is a great and iconic soundtrack in and of itself, but can feel somewhat lacking in its arrangement due to the hardware it's running on. Whereas the NES soundtrack is iconic and really, really good for what it is, the fact that the PSP version's music actually sounds like it's coming from instruments as opposed to a Square synth goes a long way in helping it resonate with the listener. However, while these changes are certainly appreciated, I could see why this version may not be for everybody. For starters, even though the updated take on the combat is a genuinely huge quality of life improvement, it does somewhat trivialize a lot of Final Fantasy I's difficulty. Despite the fact that the original Final Fantasy isn't really that hard of a game to begin with, but rather one that demands a lot of patience when playing it, the addition of a more modern magic system and automatic retargeting really feels like it takes a level of strategy out of the game that makes the NES version a pretty unique experience. So while it does feature the most content out of the bunch and arguably has the most fleshed out version of its narrative thanks to in-engine and CG cutscenes, the game's updates to the combat may keep this version from being the definitive way to play for everyone. In a lot of ways, though I can't say this with certainty because there's some variability that can come into play based off the party you make, Final Fantasy's PSP release feels like the easiest version of the game as far as accessibility goes. And because of this, I'd say that this is the version to go with if you're simply looking to play Final Fantasy I in an easily digestible fashion, while also wanting to leave the door open to explore some of its bonus content in the future. Plus, since it's an older game, going with this version also means that you can choose to emulate it in order to take advantage of stuff like speeding the game up if you feel like powering through grinding. And while you'd end up forfeiting some of the quality of life changes and potentially some of the content, you could always go with earlier versions of the game that this port was built off of, like the PS1 or Game Boy Advance releases if you can't get into the sprites here. Again though, if you feel like this is sacrilege and want something a bit more authentic to the original design philosophy, you may be better off with something else.
It's not right. We fought in wars to play Final Fantasy the way it was originally made. You can't just change something. That's not how freedom works. This is like New Coke all over again.
And now on to the Pixel Remaster, which came out in 2021 for PC and mobile. Right off the bat, the game adopts a few of the changes found in the PSP version, such as having a few items from later Final Fantasy games, such as Ethers and Phoenix Downs. It also features a world map and even pins it to the top right of your screen during gameplay, and yes, it's also mic-proof. However, it's also designed to be more in line with the original NES game. The magic system from that game is back in full swing, none of the bonus content makes it into this version, and while there are some added in-engine cutscenes, they're all relatively minimal in their execution. On top of that, the game features genuinely gorgeous new sprite designs that are inspired by the original NES game's art style, a wonderfully rearranged version of that game's score, and also features environmental changes that are similar to what was available on the PSP version. Aside from that, it's mostly just Final Fantasy I again, albeit with the lowered potential of giving the player a seizure unless you decide to sprint while a party member's poisoned. For many, these changes make it the go-to version of the game to play, and it's not hard to see why. For starters, this is the most readily available version of the game. It's fairly accessible due to its quality of life updates, and it feels relatively modern without forgoing the original heart and spirit of its original release. Even though the game does a lot of the things that the PSP update did, like updating spell names to be more in line with what they're now called in newer Final Fantasies, the game still feels decidedly rooted in its NES roots. Returning to my unwieldy Coke analogy from earlier, the Pixel Remaster is the equivalent of the modern interpretation of Coca-Cola. Have you ever noticed that a modern can or bottle of Coke says original taste on the top of it? That was actually in part due to the new Coke debacle back in the 80s. Basically, people got so tilted that their fizzy delight wasn't so fizzy or delightful anymore that Coke had to backpedal to the old recipe and slap the word classic on it to get people off their backs.
They changed my Coke.
Something wrong with it?
I know, but they sure changed it.
Coulda asked.
What coulda? I stuck with them through 3 wars and a couple of dust storms, but this is too much. Guess something big made them change.
Right, big.
And even though that classic label would get dropped in 2009, the designation that people were drinking the original tasting Coke ended up sticking around in its place. And in the case of Final Fantasy, that original flavor may as well be the Pixel Remaster. This is because the modern version of Coke obviously isn't the same as the actual original Coke formula. Its recipe is one designed to be a worthy simulacrum of the real thing, but it also brings into account the current health needs of a modern consumer and the fact that their drink now has up to 1/4 less caffeine in it than it once did. Similarly, Final Fantasy I's Pixel Remake isn't so much an austere recreation of the NES game, but rather a new take lensed in a more easily digestible package. While this game is definitely authentic to the original's intentions and is an absolute blast to play though, it has a couple of issues that prevent it from truly being the quote-unquote definitive version of Final Fantasy. First, it lacks the bonus content found in the PSP version, which means that you're technically getting less game here than you would if you decide to play that release instead. And even though I could honestly care less about that stuff, it is kind of a shame that it's been omitted since it was just sitting there waiting to get used. In leaving something like that out, it's almost implying that their so-called ultimate version of Final Fantasy I, something that Square Enix themselves claim this release would be by the way, is one that isn't designed to be the best possible product that it could be, but rather that it's one that conflates authenticity with objective quality. And for the record, that's fine. It's just that this is a weird choice because had they thrown those extra dungeons in or whatever, they would have had a better product on their hands. Second, while this version is the most easily accessible for players that are just interested in playing the game, it also lacks controller support on mobile and isn't available on consoles yet. At the time of making this video, you can only play this game on PC or mobile. And while these are two omnipresent platforms that you'd think would nullify the need for a console release, it's still strange that we weren't offered them to begin with. And even worse, it's pretty that Square Enix's response to people asking about that was that they'd basically get around to porting it to console if there was enough demand for it. It just felt like a greedy move of forcing us to buy the game on a platform we don't want it on just for the chance to buy it again for the console we wanted to play it on to begin with. And like I said, complicating that further is the fact that the mobile version doesn't feature controller support. This is my cell phone from 2018 attached to a telescopic controller. It's a Samsung Galaxy S9 that I happen to use to record gameplay for my videos, and will probably continue to do so until I get an Ein Odin Pro that I ordered a couple of months ago. Why? Because I enjoy the convenience of being able to take this thing anywhere in my house and enjoy a fairly premium game experience while also capturing crisp 1080p footage using a screen recorder. What I can't do, however, is enjoy the Pixel Remaster in a convenient and comfortable way. Don't get me wrong, I could just suck it up and play the mobile version just fine, but in doing so, I'd be forced to use touch controls even though the PC release already supports a controller. In fact, and I realize this is a total first world problem, if I wanted to play the game properly, I'd need to rely on something like Steam Link or Parsec in order to stream the game from my PC. And while this may sound like nitpicking or grumbling on my side, especially since the Steam Deck is a thing, I can't help but feel like it's a pretty unnecessary step to take in order to play the game portably with a controller. I mean, a lot of people simply don't like touch controls. Even for turn-based games like Final Fantasy, it just doesn't feel like an ideal way to play the game. Heck, it's a huge part of why I struggled to get into the iPad release of Final Fantasy IV's remake the first time I played it. It just felt super awkward to me. Third, while I genuinely appreciate a lot of the quality of life changes available in this game, they sort of run into the same issue found in the PSP version of trivializing some of the experience. A lot of them are pretty great touches because they're ultimately optional, but the presence of a map on the screen at all times really feels like an overcorrection for how easy it is to get lost in the original game. While it's also totally optional, the fact that I could basically get a bird's eye view of the world without needing to exit the screen made the world feel a lot smaller than it did in the NES or PSP game, and the ability to straight up cheese dungeons because of it also proved to be a temptation that my feeble brain couldn't resist by the third time I was playing this game.
Poor predictable Bart. Always cheesing games with the tools they give you. Girl convenience! Nothing beats that.
It's definitely a minor gripe though, since it does remedy a big problem that the original NES game had, and it is optional, but I still felt like it was worth bringing up. I think this game's primary audience is going to be people who just want to get into the game right now and can't be bothered to emulate the original PSP version or want to play with the original Magic system. I mean, it's literally something that 99.99% of the people watching this video right now can access from their cell phone, so long as you're cool with touch controls, and it is a genuinely great take on the game. You'd think that I'd have been sick of Final Fantasy 1 by the time I got to this version, but I genuinely wasn't. Its visuals were gorgeous, its soundtrack is probably my favorite of the bunch, and you can even walk diagonally in this version. Which is actually kinda weird because the map isn't really built for it in a lot of spots, but whatever. Ultimately, the Pixel Remaster is a good version of Final Fantasy I that updates the gameplay in ways that are still compatible with its NES roots. It's just a shame that it's not available on every platform right now and that it doesn't have controller support on mobile yet. Like I said at the beginning of this video, answering the question of whether or not Final Fantasy holds up doesn't exactly have a clear-cut solution. It's dependent on which version of the game you're talking about, what type of experience you're looking for, and whether or not you're willing to use something like touch controls or emulation for stuff like a speed-up function. And because of this, all I can really do is share my personal perspective on which version of the three appealed to me the most. The NES game was a lot of fun in the sense that it provided me with a brief window into the early days of the genre. While it had a lot of growing to do, the base gameplay of this version of Final Fantasy still proves to be a lot of fun and is helped greatly by the context of what it meant in the wider scope of gaming as a whole back in 1987. That said, it's also a slow, confusing adventure that didn't have many other similar games to emulate and iterate on, which meant that it largely had to chart its own course. This means that the game can prove to be a bit too foreign for newcomers looking for something approachable, and instead, those players may be better off with something like the PSP version of Final Fantasy, which is the same game with several re-releases of changes and tweaks super glued onto it. The only problem here though is that this version arguably sacrifices some of the original's charm by updating its gameplay. The game is still undeniably Final Fantasy I, mind you, but it's not hard to imagine that 20 more years of game-changing iterations based off of it would have resulted in something as deconstructed and only tangentially related to Final Fantasy as Don Hertzfeldt's take on The Simpsons was in his couch gag that he made for the show back in 2014.
Make purchase of the merchandise.
Still love you, Homer.
And that brings us to the Pixel Remaster. The latest take on Final Fantasy is one that decidedly punts the PSP version into the distance while also deciding to pick up some money out of its wallet from the aforementioned kick. It's also the most readily available version of the game, features wonderful pixel art and combines quality of life improvements with the original game's design philosophy to fairly great effect. However, it's also scant on bonus content, lacks controller support on mobile, and also isn't available on any of the major home consoles at the time of this video being written and recorded. Which doesn't sound that bad, especially since the other two versions I covered today aren't available there either, but definitely stings on account of Square Enix dangling the promise of a console release in front of us like a captive hostage. So, does Final Fantasy hold up? Well, yeah, but also no, and also it depends on what you're comfortable with. Ultimately, you can't really go wrong with any of the versions that I've talked about in this video. So long as you know what you're getting into and what features you're trading off in the process, each of these releases of Final Fantasy I are a ton of fun. While the NES version has certainly aged over the years, the game's still an extremely charming adventure that very well may be worth a look if you're looking for something austere. Additionally, the PSP port is also a fine game and personally my favorite of the bunch I think, but it's for slightly different reasons than the NES one. And last, the Pixel Remake is a great take on modernizing Final Fantasy I. In fact, it may have tied with the PSP version for me if it wasn't for the fact that it isn't available on the consoles I actually want to play it on. I wouldn't say any of these versions of the game are perfect, but then again, what game is? At the very least, what's cool about Final Fantasy I is the fact that you can try out different versions of the game in hopes of finding that magic glass slipper that'll fit your playstyle the best. And you can also eventually decide that the game may just not be for you, which is, also valid. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. Feel free to leave an answer to the question of the day if you haven't already, to like, comment, subscribe, and do all that YouTube engagement stuff that really helps me out, and to check out my Buy Me a Coffee page if you want to leave a tip and support the channel. Hey everybody, 'tis I, Niche, from a couple of weeks in the future, at least from when I filmed this part of the video. Whatever. Anyway, I just wanted to pop in and say that I actually expanded my Buy Me a Coffee to include memberships now, and I also created a Patreon. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to support me and help me create more of them in the future, feel free to check those out, as I actually am offering some content on them that may be worth your while. Anyway, before we get back to the footage of myself from a couple of weeks ago, I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the first 3 people to sign up for my Patreon. So, a very public thank you to Vance, Jellygod, and my Media Obscura co-host Raekwon, who decided to sign up for my Patreon even though there was zero obligation to do so, and I will repeatedly tell him that till the day he dies. So yeah, back to the old footage now, I guess. You could also check me out on Twitter and Instagram by looking up @Nicheplays on those respective apps or by following the links in the description, and you could check out my movie and TV podcast, Media Obscura. If you're interested in old movies and TV shows or just need some banter on in the background while you go about your day, it might be for you. It may also not be, but hey, it's free content. So yeah, bye.